Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us, or good morning, depends on where you are in the world. I appreciate everyone coming here today. You set up this webinar between myself, Raj, and Gil, who are the CEO of ThreatLocker, myself, CEO of JumpCloud, Raj, and the CEO of Atera, Gil. We've got quite a lot of experience here, but more importantly, we wanted to introduce Gary, who's going to moderate and run the webinar. Gary Reiner, he's pretty much an expert in the industry. His profile spans back to the CIO of General Electric, right through to a board member at Citibank, and knows a lot about security and a lot about IT and problems that businesses face. So Gary, I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Danny, so much. And thank you all for joining us. We're excited to bring these august three founders and leaders to talk about security for small and medium-sized businesses. And so I thought, we're going to do a combination of asking general questions for any of the three, and then kind of maybe drill a little deeper with each of the three different businesses. And so I thought just a general question, and maybe just go in order if we could, or each of you take it one at a time, which is, what are the biggest security threats to small and medium-sized enterprises kind of now, and as you see how they evolve in the future? What are each of you seeing? You're interacting with SMEs all day, every day. What are you seeing as the biggest threats?
I guess I'll jump in first. So thanks everybody for joining. I'm Rajat Bhargava, co-founder and CEO of JumpCloud. Really appreciate you joining us. But Gary, to your question, I think one of the things that we see, because we're related to identity and directory services, has been that compromised credentials. So the biggest threat is people getting phished, other sites getting hacked, and those credentials leaking, people using poor credential management. So ultimately, we feel like that you can put so much security out there, but if somebody gets the right credentials, they go right through the security layers because they are, they're basically authorized, right, if you will. So, from our side, vast majority of the breaches that we see, vast majority of the issues that we see tend to relate to credentials and credential theft in some way.
Great. Danny, how do you see it over there?
So, I think, I'll second what Raj said. I actually was on with a customer yesterday who was onboarding with ThreatLocker, and he had his RD lap. There was one of the engineers that opened up RDP on their laptop to the world from their home router, which is always great. And they didn't actually get their credentials, but we saw in the event log constant attack of the RDP password guessing on that. And if that essentially that attacker was one password away from getting access to an RMM, getting access to MSP's tools by getting onto an engineer's laptop. But I think ultimately credentials is one of the big opening points. That's a good way of someone getting through the door. If they've got the key, they can just get in. But also just malware. Obviously, malware is still very, very prevalent, and exploits as well. More and more exploits we're seeing. Over the last year, we've seen so many vulnerabilities exploited in software, from the Exchange vulnerability to which essentially could cause a massive company-wide ransomware attack, through to RMM vulnerabilities, through to other software. But malware and software credentials they're the biggest three that the causes or entry points into a security attack. Quite often with security, it's systematic, and there's lots of problems that end up being of which any solution would have solved all of them, but other times not so much.
Fabulous. And Gil?
I'll add my perspective just to scare everybody. Our value or our perspective on this is that we have a broad view. We're a network monitoring management system. And the first thing that we see is that the threats are government threats. It's coming from state-sponsored attackers. It's Russia, it's North Korea. And then there's the techniques. And the techniques, credential breaches are really the number one thing that we see, and we have visibility into that from our platform. And then malware, things like Danny talked about. But I think it's scary enough at this point that one needs to take it seriously, invest in it, know what you're doing, and make sure things are not left open.
Well, I think
so if you're running a company, or you're the CISO of or tech admin for a mid-sized company, what are the absolutely critical things, to your tech stack? What are the absolute essential things you need to be able to sleep at night, knowing that you won't get compromised in any way? Let's go around the table again. Raj, you want to take a?
I was
Sure.
going to, before you
Oh,
jump
go
in,
ahead.
I just want to reply to Gil. It's not really about what's the biggest threat. The biggest threat is cyber attacks are now consequential. The substantial. It's not like they used to be where there were malware on your machine. Small businesses are getting hit by cyber attacks at the same scale that large organizations are. Who's behind them, and then the techniques they use allows us to decide what to defend against. Because when it's not one technique, it's lots of techniques, and the people behind them are organized businesses, well-funded, yeah,
Totally.
better funded than sometimes software companies.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry,
Gary,
Gil.
Gary, let me, instead of talking maybe about specific solutions, let me maybe talk a little bit about a structured approach or a thought process.
Perfect.
Because I don't think we want to, while we're here with our companies and stuff, we still want to be sort of maybe a little bit broader in terms of giving folks a little advice on maybe just ways to think about it, and then they can figure out what are the right solutions for their organization, right? I think one of the things that's happened is the world has sort of shifted into a model that I think is a really interesting model that everybody should be thinking about, which is a little bit of zero trust, if you will. And I think you can combine that with some historical models, which are defense in depth, which is sort of the viewpoint that people have had of if you have layers of security. But ultimately, the layers of security don't prevent against what we just talked about, which is you have the right credentials. It goes right through the layers. But I think if you take a zero trust approach, and in our view, it's really talking about the access transaction. So what do IT organizations, what are we here as MSPs and all the folks out there supporting organizations? What's our goal? What are we trying to do? We're trying to make sure that the end user is productive with technology. They have access to the right technology. It's safe, it's secure, it's as frictionless as possible. Well, that's the access transaction. And so I think the access transaction is sort of the atomic unit of what an IT organization does. And it starts with the right identity, making sure that that really is the right person. So verifying, in numerous different ways, whether that's multi-factor or whatever it might be. Then you've got the device itself. The device is the conduit to what you're accessing. So making sure that that device is safe, secure, the right posture, all the things that Gil's going to talk about in a few minutes. Then you've got the network. That's the transit point. You want to make sure you're going over a secure tunnel and making sure that nobody can get into the middle of that transaction, right? That's part of making sure that you're safe and secure. Then you've got the target IT resource. So whether that's an application, a file, a network, a server, whatever it is that you're trying to attack or get to, sorry. And if you're trying to get to it, access it, then do you have the right rights? What are your permissions? Are you at the right level of depth? Do you have read, write, specific permissions? And then the next step is sort of data, making sure that that data that IT resource is attached to, you have the right rights around that. That whole transaction, I think, is a fundamental transaction that we need to make sure every point on that transaction is secure. That's really what zero trust is. That's what a lot of people in the security industry are working on. I think there's some ways to solve for that are easier than others. But ultimately, if you step back and say, we're trying to make sure that our organization stays safe and secure, well, you need to make sure every access transaction is safe and secure and it's the right one. So that's a model, I think, of looking at it. And then you can figure out the tech stack from that model.
Terrific. Absolutely terrific. Danny.
So I'm going to take it from a slightly different point of view. So, the idea of zero trust, and we use this word a lot, is really about authenticating, verifying, and making sure you only give privilege where privilege is required. It's not, it used to be called least privilege, and these all get bound into different words, but essentially zero trust is about reducing privilege where it's not required. And I think when you think about building security, that's what you should be thinking about. When you think about how do I secure my environment, don't think about buying the latest shiny antivirus, think about taking away privilege, whether that means taking away permissions from users that don't need access to data, whether that means taking away ability to run software that isn't trusted, including malware, or whether that means taking away an application's ability to do things. That if you think about security from that point of view, you're going to be in a far better state than going out and buying the most expensive EDR on the market. I can guarantee that. You always are. And that's how banks and government organizations think of it. When you think about what are the most important things, someone said to me yesterday, the US is so far behind Australia because Australia has this essential 8. And I said, no, the problem with the US is they're so far ahead of Australia, because when we think about Australians' recommendations from government, they simplified this to 8 items. So they went out to all businesses and said, you need to implement application whitelisting. You need to disable macros in Office. You need to have a firewall. I don't know, I try and reel off all 8 right now, but they went down to these really simple levels. And that's good because it's allowed businesses to actually grasp that and say, okay, I can handle that. There's 8 things I can handle there. Whereas the US went out and created NIST and all of these other standards, which has hundreds of things you should be doing. And everyone's like, well, I don't even know where to start, so I'm just going to give up. But I think the thing is, think about security from the least privilege. Yes, you need an antivirus. It's basic. You need some kind of patch management, because if you think about how a vulnerability is going to be exploited, it's going to be a 0-day or not 0-day. 90% of the time, it's not a 0-day. Have some kind of patch management system to make sure you're patching those vulnerabilities. Think about making sure software can't run in your environment that isn't trusted, that your applications are ring-fenced. Make sure you've got good credential management and identity management, because if at the end of the day, if someone has someone's password, the best, they still can gain access to whatever they would have. If you think about security like that, though, take away privilege and then put basic controls in place first. Have an antivirus, have whitelisting, have identity, have patch management. I'm sure Gil's going to add some more onto there. And don't keep jumping from one antivirus to the next or one EDR from the next because the last one let you down, because you can't fix the problem by getting a new shiny vendor.
Danny, maybe talk a little bit about, because you really alluded to it, but the whole idea of default deny in terms of what that means, because that's a phrase that a lot of security experts use. So maybe you could describe that.
So I mean, essentially, the idea is when we created firewalls in the 1980s or 1990s, or started using firewalls, the idea wasn't that we want to block everything on our network. The idea was that we'd only allow what is needed. So previously we had FTP ports open, we had web ports open, even a data center, we had email ports open. And then we said, well, let's create a firewall that blocks all ports and we'll just open the ports that we need. That concept is genius. I mean, it was genius in the 1980s, the firewall, and it's still the standard today when it comes to securing networks, but it also applies to everything else. It also applies to what programs need to run in your environment, because ransomware is just a program. So if you block programs by default, then you block ransomware. It also applies to whether a user should have access to documents. The question you shouldn't ask yourself when I'm thinking about who gets permission to what is you shouldn't ask yourself, do I trust this user? You should ask yourself, does this user need access to this data to perform their job? If not, I'm going to take it away. That's what it means when you think about security like that. You think about, well, I'm going to assume someone's going to do something bad, or they're going to be compromised through a piece of software, or that software is going to be compromised. And then we deny everything that isn't needed.
So basically anything that hasn't been pre-approved cannot run until it is approved.
Yeah, so in the case of ThreatLocker, that's what we do. We say no software can run unless it's explicitly approved. Now, we don't do it by saying nothing can run. We learn what's needed in your environment and we create that automatically for you.
And we'll come back to that, but that's the mindset, really.
Yeah, that's the mindset. Nothing that, from a software perspective, if it's not pre-approved, it cannot run.
Excellent. Yo,
I'll pitch in. So we have our point of view, which is the management of the whole network. And we have three things that we look at. One is the visibility. So as a remote network management system, the most important thing, first of all, is to see what's going on in the identity management, in the denial of authorizations, etc. The second thing is automations. Patch management is a central thing that our system has, but it's automated. It uses data to automate it, and it means that you don't have to run after every patch to make sure you're fully patched. And actually, the last thing that we have in our view is the integrations and partnerships we have within the product. And ThreatLocker and JumpCloud are amazing companies. ThreatLocker actually we're launching together in 2 weeks, and that's within this whole visibility and automation. You also have ThreatLocker, EDR of different companies, etc., and you have a single view, automated and with the best of breed in each one of the categories in the stack of security you have, and that's the way actually to start protecting yourself against North Koreans and Russian government hackers.
And Canadians.
Good.
They
So
do it nice.
let's go a little deeper on.
Canadians are polite hackers, though. Just remember.
Let's go a little deeper on each of the three. Raj, maybe just define what a directory is, just so everyone has a common view of what actually a directory is.
Sure. I think a directory is a foundational part of every organization. And I would say we think of directory as a software tool, but it could be a manual directory, right? It's basically a list of all of the people that you have and the machine accounts, automated accounts, service accounts, whatever it is. And then all the IT resources you have. And it's basically a database of the connections of those things. So who has access to what and at what level? And so, generally, historically, people have thought about the directory as by Microsoft Active Directory, but the next generation directory is being delivered by JumpCloud and others. And we're trying to take that into the cloud. We're trying to make it non-Microsoft, non-on-prem based. And we're trying to say, hey, it works with AWS, it works with Google, it works with Macs, it works with web applications, it works with all kinds of different IT resources. And ultimately, what a goal of a directory is two things. One is you're trying to make sure that that individual user on your network, in your environment, has access to whatever it is that they need. So whatever IT resources, and to Danny's point, they should only have access to the things that they need. But for whatever they do need, they have access to that, and a directory controls that. And then the second thing that a directory does, it allows an IT organization to automate the provisioning, deprovisioning, and also the changes of those rights in a systematic way. And then obviously all this stuff is done with logging and making sure that everybody knows who's done what, where, when, how, why, all of those things, so that there's security and compliance. But the foundation of a directory is sort of that central station, if you will, that is granting access to whatever IT resources a person may
So
need.
deep permissioning individuals.
Permissioning of individuals or automated accounts.
But also roles.
Everything.
And you can also do roles, and you can do functions. You can say this function can have access, but these other functions cannot.
As you scale and you grow, a lot of the directory things are done via attributes, right? So, you're in this role, in this group, maybe in this location, you need these kinds of things, right? So, when you're thousands and thousands of people, it's not possible to go through and do every single person's permissions on every single resource, because you start to think about the combination of number of people and service counts with the number of IT resources. And, it's an exponential number really, really quickly. So you're trying to create models and systems and approaches to make sure that you do deliver least privilege, and you make sure that that's really happening.
So, and one of the things about your firm, JumpCloud, is that you offer, as you said before, all from start to finish, all the way through, from an individual getting access to an application. So you offer the system management piece of the device to make sure it's healthy and clean and can access the network. You offer user authentication, you offer network authentication, you offer the directory itself and access to the applications, all the connections to all the relevant applications. Maybe a little bit about why it's beneficial to get all 5 of those pieces from the same vendor versus getting discrete solutions for any of the 5.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So obviously we've spent a tremendous amount of time. We have, hundreds and hundreds of engineers working on this problem, but ultimately the goal is integration. You need to know all of these things work together. So as I talked about earlier, the access transaction, if you had to put together 5, 6, 10 different tools to make sure that that one single access transaction to something is safe and secure, it's going to be overwhelming. It's going to be too hard. There's too many breaking points. So we knew that we needed to do that for our customers, and especially for small to medium enterprise customers who can't take the time or have the resources to go stitch together these 6, 8, 10 different tools to make sure that they have a zero trust model or a least privilege model, or they make sure that the right people have the right access. So we wanted to make sure from start to finish, you were able to do that. And ultimately, we believe that the fundamental thing that an IT organization does is it provides safe, secure access to IT resources. Well, if we can be that core IT platform for people to do that, it saves them a lot of time, and hopefully it saves them a lot of money to go do that.
To that point, then we'll move on, but maybe just talk a little bit about what it takes to install JumpCloud and make it productive for a small to medium sized business.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is, so we have a 10 users free forever model with 10 devices free, and we've got over 200,000 organizations around the world that use it. But ultimately, you can install and implement it within minutes. Basically, you come to our website, jumpcloud.com, you sign up, and then there's a lightweight agent that goes on to different machines, and then you can automatically provision and deprovision access to whether that's web resources or whether that's server infrastructure or Mac, Windows, and Linux machines, across the board. But it's very easy to set up, very easy to get going. And then we have a free model up to 10 users and 10 devices for everybody.
And one of the things you track is the number of times that users are able to manage the entire implementation and up and running without any interaction needed.
We do, yeah. And I mean, probably about 35 to 40% of our customers end up self-serving through the whole process by themselves. So yeah, and if you need our help, we have engineers and we have support and we have professional services to help. But ultimately, the idea is to create a very easy to use, simple platform that can give people a lot of control over access to IT resources, but also a lot of security and ease of use too.
Perfect. Danny, let's come to ThreatLocker. So maybe a little bit more about how it actually works if you're a company and you're gonna deploy ThreatLocker. Maybe take us through kind of what that looks like in terms of the day in the life of an administrator that's going to roll that out, either as an MSP or as a direct company.
So I think it's interesting, when we started ThreatLocker, we set out to prove two things. One is that whitelisting, and that's one of the 5 areas that we address, but that whitelisting was viable for small businesses. And the other one, that whitelisting was viable for big businesses. So that was my 2 goals, because I was told I was wrong too many times. I'm a little bit anal. So we've got 28,000 businesses using ThreatLocker now, ranging from 2-man mechanics up to JetBlue and the US Navy, and some pretty big businesses. So we really did prove that. And the story is different depending on the type of customer. Small businesses rely heavily on MSPs. And absolutely they should. And I want to answer one question in that someone points out that small businesses don't have the budget to improve security. I'm not sure it's a question, but it's marked as a question in the Q&A. Second, they cannot concentrate on the OS WP10. But small businesses cannot take on security by themselves, and we understood that, and we all understand that because we all sell to MSPs in some fashion. So in order for a small business to handle security, they have to use an MSP. That if you've got, whether you're 2 users, 10 users, 50 users, 100 users, if you don't have someone who's skilled, understands the problem, and has the right tool set, you cannot do it. And using an MSP is not expensive. Using a good MSP should not put your business, it's going to be pretty small compared to your monthly payroll bill, even as a small business. So for a small business, the way it works is you essentially go through your MSP, and your MSP deploys an agent through their tools. Gil mentioned we announced a partnership was seamlessly integrated with Atera, with other RMMs. They push out an agent and it learns what's required in your environment. At the end of that learning period, your MSP will review that. We'll do it with the MSP. So we'll sit on a call with the MSP and we'll say, let's have a look at what you've got in your environment. Let's look look at what we don't want in your environment, and let's allow the rest of it. After that learning period, it locks down. As a small business owner, you need new software, it's going to pop up and say, hey, you need new software. You can request your MSP, look at it, and the MSP will look at it. In a large organization, the process is very, very similar. It's just, instead of being an MSP, it might be an internal corporate IT structure. In some cases, it'll be co-managed, depends on the mid-sized market. You end up with this co-management. The MSP looks after some, internal IT looks after the other, but it goes through that process. And then when you do need new software, which is not very often, you have new software in your environment, not as often as many people think, you request it and your IT function can approve it in 60 seconds. We also get into hardening the apps, ring fencing them, making sure that if they're exploited, they can't eat all of your data as well.
Maybe talk about the ring fencing piece.
So essentially the idea of ring fencing is, look, software is going to have vulnerabilities, and it happens. We've seen it with Exchange, we've seen it with Office, with the Felina vulnerability, we've seen it with SolarWinds Orion. Vulnerabilities are the risk of installing software. So whenever we install software on our machine, we understand that I get a business benefit from using this, but I accept the risk, and we mitigate that risk by patching it, by looking at vendor SOC 2 reports, by making sure that they've got good security controls in place, but it doesn't remove it. Microsoft still has vulnerabilities. 20 years later, RPC still has new vulnerabilities. So what we're saying is, when you allow software, limit what it can see and what it can do. So very, very simple example, Microsoft Office needs to run on your computer. PowerShell probably needs to run on your computer. They don't need to talk to each other.
Right.
PowerShell doesn't need to see your files, and your accounting app probably doesn't need to see your files apart from the accounting files. So if you limit the amount that an application can see and limit what software it can run, the probability of an exploit being successful is massively reduced. And even if it is successful, the damage from that exploit is massively reduced as well.
And then maybe talk about what happens when a software that's been approved, a vendor upgrades that software. How does that work with you?
Well, so that was the pushback, going back at the beginning of ThreatLocker's life of, you can't do this. What happens when there's Windows updates? So Microsoft release about 80,000 unique files every single patch Tuesday, most of which are not signed. The Microsoft haven't figured out how to digitally sign files. Even PowerShell.exe is not signed yet, which is interesting that they haven't figured that one out. So it's a challenge for IT companies and for MSPs who don't have this massive team to permit all of those updates. So with ThreatLocker, what we do is we learn, we directly update those definitions for you. So if you're using Atera, you don't have to worry about an Atera update being blocked. If you're using Windows, which you probably are, or Office or Chrome or Zoom or anything else, you don't have to worry about that. When your patch management pushes it out, as long as you had an existing policy, it's going to be allowed, and we're going to streamline that. Even custom software, we're very, very good at setting appropriate rules to allow that software to update, certain updaters to update that software, and you don't have to worry about most of that. There might be a little bit of tweaking if you've got real line of business applications, but it's such a small amount, and it's the exception and not the rule.
So Danny, one last one for now. Maybe talk about, as you observe your customers, which tens of thousands of them that have deployed ThreatLocker, the administrative burden. Like how does, in terms of managing the environment with ThreatLocker, how does it compare before and after?
So there's two things. One is we add administrative burden because now there's a cop who has to give tickets to people and say you're allowed to run this software or you're not. So there is a small amount of burden added where you're having to approve new software, whereas previously users could do whatever they wanted. But the net benefit of that, and we recently had a study done by Forrester on this, is actually negative, because what happens is, think about this as an IT guy. Think about, you take your laptop, you take a brand new laptop, you give it to a user, and 5 years later, it comes back into your shop. And with the exception of the cracked screen, everything else is as it was when it went out. There's no shadow IT, there's no breaking things. Your EDR tickets dramatically reduce because users can't suddenly install random software that might reach out to this country, which causes an alert on your EDR, because your environment is more controlled. So the net benefit of this is actually a positive. The only way you really eat time in whitelisting is when you don't know it's there and you're trying to figure out why I pushed something out from my RMM and it didn't get allowed.
Yeah. Got it. All right, Gil. Thank you, Danny. So maybe talk about what it takes to deploy Atera if you're an MSP or if you're a smaller company.
So I'll a little bit elaborate or take from where Danny left off and talk a little bit about defense in depth or layered security. And when you're an MSP or a large corporate network, which we have over 10,000 customers in 105 countries, I had to say that. It's very complicated. And what you need to have in place is both the visibility of everything and the layered security. So you need patch management, and you need network protection, and you need backup, and you need EDR, and you need identity management, and you need to block. And that is exactly where Atera comes into play. We not only have all those capabilities within our platforms, in our platform to manage, but we have it with a lot of our partners built in. And we collect 40,000 data points per second that allows us to analyze what's happening in the network, on the machines, on the hard disk. We detect these abnormalities, alert on them, and have automations that will fix them. Close an RDP port that was opened by mistake by somebody just by identifying an attempt to enter through it multiple times, etc. So where Atera's importance comes into place actually in implementing defense in depth. Without actually a solution like Atera, you have these islands of solutions, but without the holistic look, the overview of everything, and the ability to manage it and both protect where you need to protect or avoid attacks, problems, etc. when they come up.
Excellent. Let's talk something that I know everyone is worried about, and appropriately so, because everyone knows somebody who was hit with ransomware. And let's talk about how any or each of the three of our solutions here minimize the likelihood of ransomware. So maybe if we just take that one angle of a breach and a concern, maybe again, Raj, start with you. Like, how does ransomware, how does it happen less because they've deployed JumpCloud?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, ransomware is a difficult one because it relates to somebody, most likely clicking on something and installing, something on the machine and things like that. So, one of the things that we do is we do have system management capabilities. So we do try and make sure that the machines are secure and locked down. They have EDR, the right policies are in place. So all that's there. But ultimately, if somebody clicks on something that they shouldn't have clicked on and, gets through all of that, and it installs, then, ultimately the way that we're going to help you is we're going to make sure that those identities are secure. So even if an identity does get compromised, we have multi-factor authentication backing our identities. So, if someone were to get a hold of an identity, you can make sure that that identity is not quite as useful because there's MFA attached to access to the device, to applications, to even a network with radius, or to LDAP infrastructure and applications and servers and things like that. So, the MFA piece of that is incredibly important to have on every single identity. If you take nothing away out of this webinar, I'd say, go back and put MFA on everything possible that you can put it on, because it's gonna help you a great deal, and it's gonna make sure that you have a better chance at protecting yourself.
And Raj, to that point, what it's worth, which is not a lot, I completely agree with you. Just maybe go a little deeper about what a typical MFA implementation would look like from a customer's point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's two things that we generally see right out of the gate, and one is web applications. So single sign-on and web applications, that's pretty easy. You put it on like a single sign-on portal that we have, for instance, or somebody else might have. And so when you're logging into that portal, you're basically making sure that you've got single sign-on access. but you're doing it through MFA. And then once you're in the portal, then you have access to Salesforce or Dropbox or NetSuite or whatever the tools are.
What will typically, you know, obviously the first factor is typically a password. What's typically that you're seeing the second factor?
You know, we're seeing typically the second factor is push. So
Push
it's
to your cell phone,
secure.
push to your mobile phone.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's super easy. TOTP is another one. TOTP is a little bit more difficult for people because you got to enter the 6 digits, but you know, people are pretty used to that now. There's so many you know, consumer web applications out there that require that. So, but we see, you know, inside of a corporate environment, push is probably the one that's used most often because it's so fast.
You seeing much in the way of biometrics yet as a factor?
We're seeing a lot of interest in it, but and definitely biometrics probably as a second factor, probably not, you know, biometrics as completely the single factor. So passwordless, you know, I think there's a whole bunch of issues with passwordless that are getting sorted out, but you know, that we will be heading towards a passwordless world in some way, whether that's, you know, you don't have to do much other than you click on your cell phone, or whether you have to enter a login, you know, username, and then you can do something. I don't know. We'll figure out how that sorts out ultimately. And people are going to be on a continuum, and there's going to be a journey here. There's going to be some things that are sort of maybe passwordless-ish, if you will. And then there's going to be things that, you know, are going to require passwords or second factors or even third factors.
And one last question in this round, password manager beyond single sign-on, maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, totally. I think to my point earlier, you know, basically there are going to be things that require passwords, and having a password manager in place across your organization is super important. We've tried to integrate password management and single sign-on and sort of SSH key management, as well as access to LDAP and Radius. And so ultimately, we truly do want to be that single place where an identity lives and you have access to everything. And we don't care whether that's password-based, whether that's single sign-on, whether you've got multi-factor authentication, or ultimately it's passwordless. You know, we don't care how that gets done. Yep. And we're going to give you choice on whatever is best for your organization.
And you're pretty close to, are you close to, or are you already offering a password manager?
The password manager will be out in a couple of weeks. So yeah, everybody within our customer base and, you know, the 200,000 organizations that use us will get access to that in a couple of weeks.
Perfect.
So on that, Raj, I have a question from
sure.
Andy. When when we're saving SSH keys in JumpCloud, what kind of encryptions, which is used to encrypt the key? What is used to encrypt the key? What type of encryption?
That's a good question. I think it's still one-way hashed and salted, but you know, because I think when you enter your password into JumpCloud, that's when it gets you know, you basically have access to everything. But that may be a better question for some of our engineers. So if you send me an email at rajat@jumpcloud.com, first name @jumpcloud.com, I'll make sure that gets routed to our engineers to take a look at, you know, what the right answer is there.
And I might just ask a question for Gil as well that's been asked by the audience. Can Atera be used for in-house IT to manage an organization?
Absolutely. We have thousands of companies from McDonald's to DirecTV and et cetera that use Atera for their internal network, and they use it for the holistic view. I didn't say it before, but we automatically run threat analysis on the networks we're implemented in, and that allows you to create automations that will then close things automatically, activate ThreatLocker, etc. So yes, the answer is yes, and we have both types of customers. And I'm Gil at Atera.com. First name.
All right.
Send me an email. Also, I'd love to talk to you.
And Danny, for you, let's talk about ransomware as something, and how does ThreatLocker handle ransomware?
So I mean, and we're kind of really at that final stage, because if you think about it, that when we see big ransomware attacks, sometimes they get in through exposed passwords, things like that. They get into your system, but at the end of the day, they have to run software on your machine. And whether we go back to the July 4th attacks last year, which it still sends shivers down my spine, where thousands of businesses were hit by ransomware, or whether we talk about a user opening an email attachment, which ultimately gives someone a foothold on your system. Ransomware is software. It has to run on your systems, and it can't just magically encrypt your files. It has to have something to execute somewhere, whether it be through a vulnerability and a misuse of a tool like regserve in Windows, or whether it be through an executable file itself. Of course, if you block software that isn't trusted, it means you block ransomware. And at some point, your EDR is going to miss that ransomware. Your antivirus is going to miss that ransomware. But if you are that policeman that's saying, stop, this software is not approved, let me review it. The 4th of July incident last year, we blocked that ransomware simply because it wasn't on the allow list. The Exchange vulnerability, which allowed ransomware to be pushed out via GPO. We've got a detailed presentation that it couldn't even create the GPO because it couldn't run the script to insert the GPO. That was blocked. Or whether it be more nuanced ransomware that misuses built-in Windows tools through ring fencing, it's very, very effective by ring fencing and whitelisting. It's a very, very definitive line of this can run or it can't run, and it's very effective against stopping ransomware at the last mile.
Just to add to a leading question on that, is it even possible? And this is a dangerous question, but I'm going to go for it. Is it even possible for ransomware to work if ThreatLocker is appropriately deployed?
So to say something's not possible is naive. It's very, very, very difficult to run ransomware while ThreatLocker is running. I haven't been able to do it, but there are other areas of concern, like was it on the system? Was it unlocked? Was the machine in monitor mode? But if you're in ThreatLocker in a secured environment, it's incredibly difficult to run anything because we just simply don't allow it to run. To say it's impossible would be naive because you're
basically inviting attacks.
Well, look, I mean, we do that anyway. We invite attacks all the time. We put RDP servers on the web with weak passwords, and we watch people try and run stuff all the time. But when you're using zero trust in general, whether we're talking about can something execute or whether we're talking about a firewall which denies by default, you're in the upper hand. So whereas when you're using detection or relying on detection, there's nothing wrong with using detection, you should absolutely use it. But when you rely on detection, you're always responding to a fire as opposed to, okay, this is blocked and then we'll respond afterwards. So nothing's impossible, but it's incredibly difficult when you're implementing general least privilege policies to do anything that's outside of the norm.
Sure. And Gil, ransomware.
So I'll take a different approach at this time regarding ransomware and how the Atera perspective is on it. Within Atera, you have ThreatLocker in 2 weeks. And you have Malwarebytes and Acronis and Bitdefender and Webroot and IronScales and MCSoft and Accent. All these are, and you can just click a button and try them. And once you do that and they're installed, they're monitored, they're managed within Atera, and you can actually build the layer defense using everything within Atera. This is all within Atera. And see what you like better, how you like to configure it, and actually create this environment that protects you from ransomware. I'll say ThreatLocker one more time because we are also using ThreatLocker internally now. And it's an amazing product, and JumpCloud as well. That's the first layer. Then the second layer with regard to ransomware is that we have the vulnerability scans that run consistently using our agents within the networks. And the minute something is identified, we use automations to close it. So you limit, even if there is a successful penetration there, you're limiting the damage dramatically. And I think that's my point of view on ransomware.
Okay, very, very helpful.
I'll add something. The patch management part of that RMM is
right, the patch management.
Because look, the biggest and worst ransomware attacks come from vulnerable software. If we think about the Exchange vulnerability, we think about the Atera vulnerability, these are the biggest attacks that happen. making sure your software is patched. People can still run executables and they can still potentially encrypt files on your network. But when we think about complete domain failure, that's, the patch management in your RMM is critical for that. I did want to try and squeeze some questions in here as well. Someone's asked about Print Nightmare. The update, which is still not solved it yet. Microsoft's doing a lot of things and it freely allows ransomware to run. I don't know if you guys have an opinion on that. Print Nightmare isn't so much about running ransomware as about running elevated code. So it allows a print driver, which traditionally would not have been able to be installed as an admin, to run under system as an elevated user. I don't believe it gives any more ransomware permissions other than, yeah, you can encrypt the Windows files, any less access to your data than if a user was just running that software by themselves. It does allow it to gain system level access, which is obviously more concerning. Is there a way to block it? You guys, I don't know if you want to add anything, but from our perspective, that print driver cannot run if it's not on the whitelist. Microsoft has made changes where you have to elevate for that. I don't know if you guys wanted to add anything on that.
I don't think so.
I'll add something on the patch management just to point out that Atera automatically patches Windows machines, Apple machines, and in a few weeks, Linux as well. So we cover the whole gamut. That was a very good point, Danny. Thank you for that. But we cover the whole.
I'm so sorry, Gil.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm just looking at some of the questions that have come in, which are great questions.
And we're trying to get through all of them. So if we don't get through them, please, apologies. There's a lot. So
there's one here for ThreatLocker. Does ThreatLocker use canaries and can it detect errant services running in the background?
So canaries are essentially, it's interesting, we actually use them internally to determine when we're deciding to approve software, whether we want to allow it on behalf of customers. Because one of the benefits of ThreatLocker is if you are a small business or even a large business and you don't have an internal IT team, we can act as your approval center. The idea of a canary just is to basically say, here's a file, I'm going to see if someone's going to hit it. And if they're going to hit it, I'm going to shut down this program. It's not relevant in a live running environment at ThreatLocker because two reasons. One is the program's not running. The other one is it should be ring fenced so it can't see data, it can't. So we don't use canaries in our customer's environment because the program shouldn't be running. We do use them when determining and testing software and when built-in apps that we approve updates for, we use them to check they're not doing anything bad before we implement that built-in app, things like that, but not in a customer environment.
Excellent. Raj, there was a question about with JumpCloud about is the 10 free user accounts going away?
No, it's not going away. I think Andy, who I know, I think he was referring to with MSPs. We give the MSP 10 free. So I think that's what we were referring to. So we give the MSP 10 free, and then clients don't get 10 free from there.
Okay.
There's a question here: is ThreatLocker going to be available through Atera? The answer is yes, within 2 weeks.
Okay.
And if
you
you
heard
want,
it here first.
right?
You heard it here first.
Right. And if and Alan, if you want to be first on there to kick the tires, send me an email, and I'll get you on the program even before it launches.
Gary, should we go back to the top and just make sure we do a recap because we're coming up on time, maybe just to make sure that for folks, if they have a question around sort of, I really want to know, does the architecture of how to approach security that the three of us are talking about make sense to folks? Is there something that we're missing or not understanding that people are wondering about? But just trying to make sure that there's a structured approach that folks can take when they're thinking about security, so they're not, like Danny said, not just grabbing the latest, greatest, shiny new object out there, but there's a structured approach to security for SMEs, especially.
It's a great question. I'll try to summarize and then let's hear, right. And then you guys improve on it because I know you can. But if I think about, Raj, the offering you have at the very high level, it is basically allowing users to get access to their applications, only those that they're allowed to have, in a simplest way possible and to be deployed as simple as possible, but to be sure that it's done securely. And you do a marvelous job of making it easy for companies to deploy that and do that. Whereas Danny basically takes a different approach, but also an incredibly critical one, which is to make sure that the things, only that which has been approved can be installed, can run, and can communicate with applications that it's allowed to. Anything that's not been approved cannot run. And it's a different approach, but they're totally additive in terms of making the company that much safer. And then Gil's approach is to basically be able to kind of monitor and patch those things that are not up to where they need to be. And so, to my mind, the three together make up a true tech stack that any company in the world would be good to have, lucky to have, and my own view is ought to feel awfully secure with all the threats that are out there. So that's how I think
it feels like the three of us reduce a heck of a lot of surface area for people to go after.
Good way to
right?
put it. It's
So,
a much better
you
way
know,
to put it than I did.
yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of like it's pretty amazing when you start to put the three things together. And of course, there's probably other things out there that would be useful as well. But, you know, reducing that surface area seems like, you know, you can make a lot of strides on, you know, 2, 3, 4 different things to do that would, you know, put yourself in a better position to withstand any attacks.
And I think one of the things that the three of you have all done at the same time is made it very easy without a whole lot of both either tech expertise or technical resources to deploy these and to manage them. And credit to you guys that you have done that, given the target markets that you've gone after. Danny, anything you'd add?
So I think you know, the first principle is take away privilege, and the tools here that can help achieve that: identify what you've got, figure out what you need, take away privilege across the board. That is going to give you more bang for your buck. And look, there's no way you can go tomorrow and find a solution to solve all your security problems. The question is, what can you do today that has more impact than anything else? That's what you should always ask about security. And then when you do those high impact things, then you can start trying to get that last 0.1%. And that's when you start saying, I'm going to spend a load of money on the best EDR and build an in-house SOC and do things like that. But takeaway privilege should be your number one priority. There are a lot of standards out there that recommend what you should be doing for security. And I mentioned Australian 8 at the beginning of this, and I feel like this is the simplest, but it's not complete by any means. But I almost feel like if you go down to the Essential 8, Australian Essential 8, it basically tells you use dual factor authentication, use whitelisting, disable macros. It gives you your basic 8 things you should be doing. That is a really good starting point. That's not the end. There is no end to security. But if you start off with things like that, standards like that, and then you move up to CIS, and then if you want to start going through even more detailed, that's great. But start off with something smaller. There are, in my mind, 8 things that every company should be doing at a minimum. And then you can go up to a more advanced stack if you want to go past that.
Excellent. And Gil, anything you'd add here?
I just want to say here to, 1 second, there was a question here I wanted to answer. There's a lot of questions. To Mike Ward, customer of Atera, yes, please wait for the ThreatLocker integration in 2 weeks. Better to buy it within the system, have it a single pane of glass and everything together.
Okay.
But I think that's it, yeah.
So I had one question that came up on ThreatLocker there, and I'm trying to find out who it was, which was asking about, I'm using ThreatLocker, but I'm not necessarily think I'm using it to the full extent. I can tell you nobody's using it to the full extent, so you're probably right there. It doesn't matter how well you. But here's the thing, book a call with the solution engineer. We don't charge for this. We encourage everyone, and we almost bully everyone to do this once a quarter. Book a call with a solution engineer and ask them, what can I do now to make my life better? You know, ask them about NAC, ask them about how can I do better ring fencing? What can I do with my storage policies? You don't have to achieve it all on one call. You can book a few calls over a few weeks. They will help you. They'll look at your account and say, well, what can we do? Just like I said, pick the the battles that are going to win the most now, they're going to do the same with you. They're going to say, well, this is what will help you the most now. This will reduce your surface area the most now. And they will walk you through that. We don't charge for that. It's included in our service. So if you're using ThreatLocker, book a call with your solution engineer. If you don't know who it is, just go into your account manager or email support, and they will find out who it is, and they will walk you through what they think you could be doing to make it better. The road never ends. It's always better. You can always be better. You can always be more secure. There becomes a point where you don't want to anymore because it's not worth the pain. Isn't worth the input. But most customers are, I feel like, 30% in the journey where I want them to be. So do call your solution engineer.
And if there are questions that you really want to get direct answers afterwards from these three gentlemen, I think the emails are Rajat at jumpcloud.com. It's Danny at threatlocker.com and Gil at Atera.com. So I know they'd be delighted to hear from you.
all
Keeping it
first
easy.
name. Yep, first name
also
at company name.
Yeah.
That's the founder tie that gets your first name emails.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, everybody else we say you got to do first name, last name, or some other thing, right?
Exactly. I think we're out of time.
Gil, you
I
had
just
something?
want one
Please.
second to Rebecca to send me an email. I'll make sure that you're taken care of. That support takes care of you. Please send me an email directly.
Great.
Uh,
And Raj, you
Yeah.
wanted to say something?
No, I thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Obviously, it's great. I mean, we're really, all three of us are really passionate about this area, and hopefully we've shown you different viewpoints too, right? I mean, we don't want to have just one viewpoint, so everybody can sort of pick and choose what makes sense to them, their organizations. And, if we can be helpful, please reach out to us. I mean, all three of us would be more than happy to do that.
Absolutely.
And very much hope that this was a helpful, useful view into the current state of the art of cybersecurity. So thank you all very much for joining, and wish you well. Thank you.
Everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Dan.
All right.
Raj.